Ai Weiwei, controversial in a completely different way. Okay, so the sunflower seeds, there are 100 million of them. 100 million of these sunflower seeds. They're made of porcelain, individually painted. They're made in molds, but each is painted, takes 4 or 5 strokes per seed to paint it, and 100 million. That's an enormous number. Now, his use of sunflower seeds goes back, once again, to Maoist propaganda. It was very common for Mao to be represented as the sun and the people of China as sunflowers, sucking up the beautiful sunshine, the enlivening sunshine. And also, sunflower seeds were a very common snack, he said. Even amongst the poor, people would just share sunflower seeds. So he had over 1,600 people working on this project. My pronunciation is going to be off on this, but the town where they were made is Jingdezhen, which is an ancient porcelain manufacturing town. They have been doing pottery there for over 2,000 years. And so the history of porcelain, so those of you, I mean, when you do Asian art history, you deal with porcelain, right? And when you do Dutch still life, you deal with Chinese porcelain. I mean, this is a material that had an enormous influence on the way that China interacted with the rest of the world once those sort of global trade routes opened up. Chinese porcelain was so much better than anything being made in Europe. European clays were comparatively fragile, heavy, thick, whereas porcelain was fine and light and translucent. It was a material of extraordinary value. And so this town, this is what they've been doing in this town for 2,000 years. It's the primary mode of production in this location. Sorry?
Did you say what the town was?
I gave it, yes. I'll spell it for you, because I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Jingdezhen. Gdzhen. Jingdezhen. Yep. So there is this very long history of things made in China being precious, valued, loved things. In the 20th century, that has changed. What does made in China mean? Cheap, trashy, and increasingly made by workers who are potentially being exploited. So, I mean, 20 years ago, made in China for most people just meant cheap. Today, it carries not only the idea that it might be cheap, but also that there's a moral failure in consuming these goods. So this sort of transition has affected this town, right? Porcelain is no longer the major export from China. So tons of people in this town were out of work. So this project, when he came in, it was huge. It was this massive, massive project to make 100 million sunflower seeds that employed the entire town. So there was a lot of enthusiasm, but also a lot of this is really dumb. What are we doing? We're making, why on earth are we making these sunflower seeds? You can't eat off them. You can't drink out of them. You can't use them. They look like little pieces of trash. And we're making 100 million of them. So there is this sense in the work context, the labor context, where he's employing all of these people. And there were there's a video that sort of shows how these are made that you can watch. And there are interviews with some of the workers. And, there is this, they're like, yeah, I'm so happy. I made so much money. But they're also kind of laughing at him. This is a silly project to be doing. Now, he's spoken. So again, this is Turbine Hall. This is the same space as the Dora Salcedo work. And I don't know what kind of funding they provide artists. for Turbine Hall presentations, but I imagine it's substantial. I mean, if you're an artist and you want to do something really ambitious, like 100 million handmade sunflower seeds, this is the place to do it. And I've actually, a friend of mine who saw this exhibition came home with a handful of the seeds. I don't know how often this happens. Yeah, and it's extraordinary. Like, you hold them and you want to bite them to be sure. They're so convincing. They're light. They have that dry kind of almost powdery quality that toasted sunflower seeds have when they've been salted. So initially, it's this huge spread, and it's been raked, so it's very, very smooth and unified. So you have this surface that is a massive monumental surface. So monuments usually rise up. This one just spreads out. It's homogeneous, but each thing in it, was made by a person. You can just picture them, right? Painting those little. Now, initially, I don't know if you guys heard about this. The idea was that people could go in and play in it and like roll around, and what happened? Yeah. Sorry?
Well, partly they would break, right?
That actually wasn't the problem. The primary problem was the dust. The dust was toxic somehow. Yeah. It's a good question. I don't know. And also, then you've got to wonder, the people who made them.
Again, the exploitation.
Yeah. Exploitation in contemporary art it's actually a really interesting theme. Like, there are a number of artists who are doing. Santiago Sierra, are you guys familiar with him? He's distressing. He's a Spanish artist, and he does things like he'll go to, say, Cuba, and he will find 6 prostitutes, and he will pay them as much money as it takes, which is often on average the shot of a price of heroin, to tattoo a line across their backs. So then these women have tattoos for the rest of their lives, and they got a shot of heroin out of it. And his work is about exploitation and the variation in cost in different locations. So where an economy is depressed, it's very cheap to tattoo a line on someone's back. Somewhere where the economy is healthier, it's more expensive. It's harder to find people who will do it. Sierra, S-I-E-R-R-A. Extremely controversial, and intentionally so, right? He wants to make people uncomfortable. Whereas Ai Weiwei is not setting out to, when he presents what he's doing here, it's not about exploitation, it's about supporting a community. But once artists have started paying other people to make their work, especially when they're artists as renowned and well supported financially as Ai Weiwei, questions come up about their labor force, because they're not usually unionized. I wanted to offer this as a sort of counterpoint, this work by Francis Alice, When Faith Moves Mountains. So in this work, a crew of 500 people in Peru gathered in a line at the base of a sand dune, a 1,600-foot sand dune, and they began to shovel. They moved it 4 inches, the entire dune. They just shoveled up and then down. They were volunteers, however. All 500 volunteered to do this, and many of them had no sense of who Francis Alice was, and were not part of the contemporary art conversation that would recognize this as an art project. Basically, somebody came to them and were like, hey, do you want to do this thing? We're going to move a sand dune by 4 inches. Do you want to participate in this? And people got excited about the idea of being a part of something this big and also this small, right? It's meaningless. It's a giant sand dune that moved 4 inches. Nothing really changes. But this sense that also they moved a mountain. So Alice's practice in this case can be compared, I think, to Ai Weiwei's in interesting ways. But again, that use of a volunteer workforce as opposed to paid labor just raises questions worth exploring. Are you guys familiar with this work? It's interesting. It hasn't received as much attention as some of his other projects, but I think it's one of the more effective. It's also, I brought it in because it's a really good example of the idea of a sort of global contemporary speaking a very Western language. So the Sichuan province earthquake in 2008, approximately 5,000 children were killed when their schools collapsed. And their schools collapsed because they were made of substandard materials, they were poorly built, bribes were being handed around, and substandard work was done. They died because of corruption, not just because of an earthquake, right? And their names were not released. The government kept their names secret. The government was extremely secretive about what had happened. And Ai Weiwei was very aggressive about covering this. He went town to town collecting the names of people's children who had died. And he was publishing all of this on his blog. He's doing everything he can to get this sort of news out. And a lot of people believe that his arrest, which was officially for tax fraud, was really because of this. It was because of the way that he covered the earthquake. Anyways, this project, he went to the wreckage of the schools and he collected the rebar. So here you see it in its original state, just mangled, right? These like totally mangled bars of iron. And then he had crews straighten them out. Like, I mean, the effort that goes in to straightening a piece of bent up, I mean, I can't even imagine. And he presented this work at the Venice Biennale in 2013. And so on the one hand, it's this incredible, devastating monument to loss. On the other hand, it's presented in the form of like a cool minimalist artwork, right? It looks like something that Richard Serra might have made. This sort of rusted metal, these big stacks, this sort of endless pile. This speaks a language that visitors to the Venice Biennale would understand and identify with. They would find it aesthetically pleasing. But the story attached to it is much more loaded than we generally find in a work that looks like this, stacks of metal bars. Are you guys familiar with this one? Yeah. Neolithic vase with Coca-Cola logo. So basically, he bought this vase. I don't know how much he paid for it, but I imagine a lot. It's really, really old. And he painted a Coca-Cola logo on it. So why do that? What is the benefit of this kind of action? Is it destructive or productive? I mean, they're the ones where he actually like dropped a Han Dynasty urn. That was literally destructive. In paint, yes. So, I mean, what do you think he's getting at with this? Why would he, one, invest in these precious historical objects and then sort of destroy or corrupt them in this way?
I don't really know, but I mean, perhaps he's saying something about like the value of this vase is only attached because of what we perceive it to be. We perceive that this ancient thing represents something amazing that should be in a museum.
Like Coca-Cola does.
Like Coca-Cola.
Or Nikes.
Yeah, just like,
that
so
fetish value.
Too.
Right.
Know, these global brands today are incredibly valuable and incredibly powerful, but it's all constructed meaning for different societies.
Right, that we have given it this value. It's not in its use value. Like the Coca-Cola, I had a friend who once had like a leading figure in Pepsi Cola come in their advertising and PR, come and give a talk, and she was like, my job is to convince people that they should pay $1.15 for 3 cents worth of sugar water. Like that is my job, and I'm really good at it. So this sense that these are wildly valuable commodities. But also, I think this sense that contemporary China is being overwritten so rapidly, the speed at which things are being torn down and built back up is unimaginable here. Like, I just think we have here everything, and we're just moving at a turtle's pace, slowly building, you know, lots of space. Whereas in China, first there's the Cultural Revolution, which actively and aggressively destroys an unimaginable cultural heritage. And then contemporary capitalism, I mean, China might still officially be communist, but it's totally capitalist, and in a very aggressive way. So capitalism in China is now doing what the Cultural Revolution did, but instead of for ideological reasons, it's for commercial reasons. So this sense that this ancient history, this sort of patrimony, is being erased and destroyed.